Hey guys, today we're going to be covering the Civil Rights Movement, looking specifically at the 1960s, which is a key period in which the Civil Rights Movement achieves both its greatest successes, but also during which the Civil Rights Movement ends. And we're going to take a look at what they accomplished in the 1960s and also what the movement fails to accomplish and leaves undone. Here are your video goals. So a good way of thinking about the Civil Rights Movement is to look at it in different stages. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at it in 3 stages. Stage 1, the earliest stage, is a stage of organization. From 1955, with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, with the Montgomery bus boycott, and up to 1963, basically with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. During this time period, we see the Civil Rights Movement is increasingly visible and receives increasing support around the country, both from black and white citizens. Second is stage 2, stage I'm going to call the legislation period, or the legislation stage. And this is the first 2 years of LBJ's presidency, 1964 to 1965, where the Civil Rights Movement achieves major legal breakthroughs. And basically what happens here is the federal government enforces legal equality in the South, as well as other major laws forcing racial equality around the country. And then last of all, stage 3 is a stage I'm going to call fragmentation, from 1965 to 1968, ending in 1968 when LBJ decides not to run for a second term and the Republican Richard Nixon wins the presidency. And what you see in this stage is a wave of racial unrest in major cities, including northern and western cities, increasing separatist elements in the Civil Rights Movement, and a loss of northern white support. Alright, so let's start by looking at the first stage, the stage called organization. So during this period, civil rights groups build up stable organizations to press for civil rights action. And we've already looked at some of these because they came up in our unit on the 1950s. So some of these are the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and the Nation of Islam, which maybe is more of a religious organization, but it also focuses on building up sort of black unity through the spread of Islam around the country. And so anyway, these organizations grow and become more influential, and also largely due to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they become much more powerful as a wave of nonviolent demonstrations and protests spread throughout the country. And some of these protests include sit-ins, where basically black people in the South go into supposedly all-white restaurants or other public buildings and just sit there and peacefully refuse to recognize the laws of segregation. Also, you see groups called Freedom Riders, both black and white people riding around on the interstate bus system in the South, challenging rules calling for segregation of bus stations and interstate buses. And most famously, the March on Washington in 1963, when started out as kind of a grassroots movement, where people were actually literally going to march to Washington. Once people heard about this, the larger organizations got involved and set up buses to bring in hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country. What you ended up seeing is somewhere between 200 and 3,000 people showing up and marching in Washington. And this was a racially integrated protest. There were both black and white supporters there. Observers estimate that about 70 or 80% of the marches were black, whereas 30 to 20% were white. And it was here at the Lincoln Memorial looking over the reflecting pool and with a view of the Washington Monument that you can see there, that Martin Luther King delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech, and kind of became the culminating event in the first part of the civil rights movement. It was a very powerful call for racial equality and racial integration, and it was overwhelmingly popular throughout the country, especially with white voters, and it won a lot of support for the integrationist wing of the civil rights movement. Some people didn't really like this. Malcolm X has rather controversially called it the farce on Washington, because he argued that originally it was going to be a sort of radical march by poor, disenfranchised black people on Washington to demand real change, and instead it ended up being sort of a peaceful gathering that didn't really do much in the end. So anyway, regardless, this became a sort of watershed moment in the civil rights movement. In response to the growing visibility of the civil rights movement and to the enormous moral power that Martin Luther King and other nonviolent leaders were acquiring, people had to respond. So Northern whites, who were becoming more and more aware of the civil rights movement, overwhelmingly supported Martin Luther King and the SCLC. JFK, who was president at the time of the March on Washington, supported the movement in spite of the fact that he might risk losing the next election. In fact, he said, "I'll lose the next election, I don't care." He viewed supporting Martin Luther King as a moral issue and was willing to go down helping the civil rights movement. Southern whites, on the other hand, responded with violent opposition, killing a number of civil rights workers in the South, and most infamously bombing a church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 little girls were killed in 1963. As a result of the growing power of the nonviolent integrationist wing of the civil rights movement, stuff got done. And even though JFK was assassinated in 1963 for reasons not related to the civil rights movement, most likely, LBJ takes over and continues where JFK left off. And LBJ promises to pass civil rights legislation, and he delivers. He manages to pass 3 really major reforms that have revolutionary consequences for race relations, both in the integrated South and elsewhere. So the first major legislative breakthrough is the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. And this act bans discrimination in public places and increases federal power to fight discrimination. So basically, this ends segregation in the South, and it allows the federal government to send in agents to make sure that southern states are complying. Basically, that they can't keep doing segregation in spite of the law. So segregation is over in 1964. And so one of the major things that Martin Luther King and the SCLC were calling for has been accomplished. Additionally, and kind of coming out of the Civil Rights Act, was something called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was a government agency that goes around and makes sure that people don't discriminate when they hire along race or gender lines. So basically, businesses aren't allowed to hire or fire somebody because of their race or their gender. And in order to make sure that businesses are complying, the government enforces something known as affirmative action, where companies basically have to prove that they're not discriminating by hiring a certain number of racial minorities and women. Affirmative action has been really controversial because some people claim that it promotes people who don't necessarily deserve a position, or that it's somehow condescending to hire somebody just because they're black to fulfill a affirmative action requirement. But on the other hand, this opens up a number of opportunities for groups, both women and racial minorities, that had never been there before. So with the Civil Rights Act, a major victory had been accomplished, but there was still one major problem in the South, and that was that black voters were basically not allowed to vote. The Civil Rights Movement went on to challenge this. And so in the South, even though the Constitution promised the right to vote to all people, the 15th Amendment promised this, the South had set up a series of laws that basically made it impossible for most black people to vote. And two of the most infamous laws were poll taxes and literacy tests. So poll taxes were a fee that you had to pay in order to vote, which basically was set high enough that only rich people would vote. And since black people in the South were generally not very wealthy, this meant that only white people voted. Second, literacy tests were put in place that were basically biased to make it easier for white people to vote than black people to vote. It didn't help that black schools were not very good, so it was harder for black people to acquire the skills necessary to pass literacy tests. So basically those were two ways to legally prevent black people from voting. Also, there was just straight up illegal intimidation and murder of anybody who tried to vote or register people to vote. And in 1965, 3 people were murdered and their bodies were hidden because they were trying to register black people to vote in the South. And yeah, so that was kind of an example of this illegal intimidation and murder that happened to prevent voting. To challenge this, Martin Luther King and the SCLC organized a march in Selma. I think it's in Alabama. Selma, Alabama. And this was designed to be a peaceful demonstration where they marched from the city of Selma to, I think it was Birmingham. I need to check that. But so a peaceful march in Alabama to push for equal voting rights, and the state of Alabama retaliated brutally, sending out police in riot gear to shut down, or at least try to shut down the march. And one demonstrator was actually killed by the police in this march. But Alabama was powerless to stop progress, and LBJ was able to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which eliminated all legal barriers to voting and gave the federal government the right to essentially run Southern elections to make sure that black people were allowed to vote. And this is major because black people made up a very large portion of Southern governments. And this meant that Southern governments could no longer just ignore black people's needs, but instead politicians would have to try and win black votes by taking care not just of white people's needs, but of the entire population's needs. So that is another major breakthrough. This brings us, however, to the third stage of the civil rights movement. And it was in the year of 1965, just as the Voting Rights Act was getting passed, that a wave of race riots erupted in cities across the country, especially in northern and western cities. The first one was in the city of Los Angeles, in a black neighborhood in the city known as Watts. And it was a protest that was sparked because of police brutality. Black people in this neighborhood were tired of the police and their violent tactics, and they broke out in sort of a violent revolt known as a riot. And they destroyed businesses and stole and looted for days before the riot was brought under control. But this was just one of dozens of race riots that erupted in 1965 and the following years. And it happened all over the place, and it was basically for the same reason. Poverty, segregation into poor areas of the city, and police brutality. And these riots that erupted everywhere shocked Northern whites, who liked to imagine that race and segregation were really just Southern problems, and that the North was basically cool on issues of race. But as these race riots prove, this is not the case. In fact, Malcolm X insisted that the North was just as bad, if not worse, than the South, in terms of segregation and racism. And so civil rights leaders start to demand more than just political equality, demand more than just an end to segregation and voting rights. They start to demand economic equality, and they also start to speak out against the Vietnam War, calling for global justice. And this is controversial. It's calling for economic reform and economic help for black people in poor areas is a pretty serious step, and it would definitely involve lots and lots of government money to address this problem. And criticizing Vietnam is also viewed as a pretty radical step. And this loses a lot of sort of middle of the road, moderate white support for the civil rights movement. In addition to this, you start to see the rise of separatist elements in the civil rights movement. So for a long time, separatist movements played kind of a smaller role, and the integrationist wave led by Martin Luther King was the predominant element in the civil rights movement. But after 1965, separatist movements become more powerful. The Black Power movement begins, very much influenced by the ideas of Malcolm X, and they demand basically greater black control of economic and political systems. They demand independent black businesses. They think black people should start up their own farms, run their own food stores, run their own banks, and that way black people could look out for themselves rather than being dependent on white businesses and white money. Linked to the idea of Black Power was the rise of the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party started as an armed citizen militia that would essentially follow police officers around in poor black neighborhoods. And basically, they would carry weapons and watch the police. And if it looked like the police were going to harass or harm black people, the Black Panthers would intervene, sometimes violently. And they were an incredibly controversial group, and they argued that northern cities were just as bad as the South, and they were still just as segregated as they had been before. So basically they argued that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act hadn't really fixed the main problem, which was was segregation and poverty in mostly black areas. And linked with the rise of the Black Power movement was the rejection of white cultural standards. So basically, earlier in the civil rights movement, black leaders tried to appeal to white voters in order to get their support for stuff like the Civil Rights Act. And if you ever see pictures of like the March on Washington, you'll see that the marchers are all dressed in like their nicest clothes and all sorts of stuff. But with the rise of the Black Power movement, black leaders start to advocate the rejection of white norms. So you start to see the rise of new styles in black communities, new clothing styles, and also new hairstyles, especially the afro, which celebrated sort of natural black hair instead of treating hair to look like white people hair. And also the rise of African-inspired names rather than sort of traditional Christian or Western European names. But so this is all very interesting, and they raise very important points about economic inequality. But a major problem with this is that the civil rights movement starts to lose the support of white voters. And white voters, a lot of them are either scared or uncertain of this new, more radical tone that has become prominent in the civil rights movement. And this brings us to sort of the end of the civil rights era. And between 1965 and 1968, you see key figures in the civil rights movement are killed. Malcolm X is killed in 1965 by members of the Nation of Islam who are unhappy with the fact that Malcolm X has started his own independent, slightly more moderate civil rights group. And so he is killed in 1965. Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, soon after he starts advocating for economic reform and criticizing the war in Vietnam. And Robert Kennedy, who was a presidential candidate who had called for even more dramatic civil rights movements, and the brother of John F. Kennedy, is killed in 1968. And so this, combined with sort of LBJ's failure to manage Vietnam, brings an end to the civil rights movement. So Johnson really was deeply committed to continuing civil rights reform, and he wanted to bring about the economic reforms necessary to bring about real equality between black people and white people in America. And as part of this, he had vowed to wage a war on poverty, and he had promised, he had spoken and said that we shall overcome, that he would make these necessary reforms. But largely because of Vietnam, he was not able to carry through on his promise. Vietnam drained the funds that were necessary in order to pass these, or to pay for these reforms, but they also drained a lot of Johnson's support. And so Johnson wasn't popular enough to get all of this stuff done. And eventually Vietnam is so bad that Johnson decides he shouldn't even run for re-election. So he chooses not to run for re-election, and this allows a Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, who we've already heard about, to win in 1968. And the Republicans are much less committed to civil rights reform. And with the election of Richard Nixon, this essentially brings about an end of the civil rights movement for the 20th century. And so that is kind of the end of the story. And here once again are your video goals. Please make sure that you know these so you can get an A on your video test tomorrow. See ya.